What's on IU Day?
Thank you.
This is great. All right, hey, welcome everybody. Happy IU Day. We have a little bit of fun to kick things off before we turn it over to our distinguished speaker for the day here, Stephanie, and that is to recognize our research awardees. So first off, congratulations to all of them because they've done a fantastic job. We're just going to have the three come up, if that's okay, one by one here. We'll do Stephanie last, so we can just transition right over then at that point. So maybe Ariana, if you wouldn't mind coming up first. Guys, you know Ariana well. Teaching anthropology. Our newest research awardee. She'll be continuing her research on stealing recipes, ownership claims, and the culinary commons, which is so cool. I love this work. So we got the letter, we got the certificate. Congratulations, Ariana.
Thank you.
We nailed it. We nailed it. Grab a cookie as well. Congratulations. No, it's great. And Brittany. Brittany next. Yes, Britt. PhD in political science. Continue her research, building state legitimacy through vaccination campaigns. Could not be a more important, timely topic. Excited for IAC and otherwise. Congratulations, Britt. It's really well deserved. You can grab a cookie too. Well done. And of course, Stephanie. Stephanie. Get it right. Obviously from O'Neill, drivers of persistence and resilience of urbs and forested patches. So continuing the work for today, which is going to be fantastic as well. So Stephanie, congratulations. We did it. We did it. And small thing, but the small thing, but the promotion and tenure cases have now been officially announced. So congratulations to our newest full professor, Andrew Raymond, across that finish line. No small feat, there. So the fun will only continue now in a different tone, perhaps, but it will continue. So thank you so much for moderating. This is terrific, and congratulations again to everybody.
Everybody, welcome to Neostrom Research Series session. Today, our second to last meeting, I'm happy to introduce you to Stephanie Freeman-Day. Stephanie just started her 4-year environmental science PhD program at O'Neill. In December, she became a PhD candidate. Right now, her main focus is on her dissertation, which is about urban forest patches. Before this, she got a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology from IU and a Master in Environmental Sustainability from IU SPIA. So, you're welcome. And
excellent. Thank you for the introduction, and we'll try and continue the fun, Scott. I'm Stephanie Freeman-Day. I'm presenting on my work on urban forested patches as common pool resources, key factors in governance for resilience and persistence. So, as a little bit of background, this is a manuscript that will be a dissertation chapter for me with hopes of publication in the next 2 to 4 months, somewhere in there. My entire dissertation is focused on urban forested patches, which are a relatively new focus of research, especially for the US. Most of the published work I've found has been put out since 2020. In that work and in the work I've been doing, I've definitely found that institutional analysis is a useful lens. UFPs are so socio-ecological in nature, being natural resources in locations where people have a lot of influence and have a lot of impacts from positive impacts, usually from the urban forested patches. I'll bring you right to my research questions. There are 3 of them. First, I wanted to know in what cases do urban forested patches meet the definition of common pool resources? How are difficulty of exclusion and subtractability best considered in terms of urban forested patches? And then, based from that, which of Eleanor Ostrom's design principles are most applicable for successful governance and management of urban forested patches as common pool resources? And do these principles need modification for use in urban forested patches? And third, so that we can measure governance and its success, how can the IFRI or International Forestry Resources and Institutions data gathering instrument be modified to the forested patches in urban settings? And I'll get more into details on that third thing, especially later.
This is just one chapter in your dissertation.
This is one chapter in my dissertation. It's a theoretical chapter, the final chapter.
The final.
Yes.
Okay.
So the table on the right, we've all seen a lot of times the categories of types of goods. As far as urban forested patches or UFPs, they're on urban land, and that's a resource with variable subtractability and variable excludability. In these UFPs, they provide intangible ecosystem services to people that live nearby and sometimes a little further away. Of course, urban trees aren't harvested like you would see in like a typical subsistence forest, but the land they occupy is subject to claim for other uses. And that is what I would consider the parallel harvest. That's based off Fisher and Steve's work in 2008 on street trees as common pool resources, because the land they occupy is rivalrous in nature. People want to use it for parking or other sorts of things. We're all familiar with Hardin's work, 1968, the tragedy of the commons, where common pool resources are subject to degradation or destruction. And those two options that he saw is privatization or management by state. However, of course, Asham did find that cases exist globally of common pool resources that are governed successfully by user groups themselves, this third option. So we'll back up a little bit and define urban forested patches for people that are less familiar with that. These first general definitions are of the urban forest itself, which, as you can see, are really any trees in an urban setting. They might be street trees, they might be park trees, they might be trees in people's yards, patches of trees, or trees standing alone. Urban forested patches are a specific sector of the urban forest. So they themselves are systems that might have an overstory of trees and an understory of vegetation, animals, creatures living within, people dependent not on them for subsistence, but for things like ecosystem services, like shade provision. So that's a whole different part of the forest in that they kind of exist as more of a parallel to a rural forest in an urban setting. For the purposes of this project, I want to define a minimum threshold for size and canopy density to define what an urban forested patch might be. And I'm basing that off of the acre defined by the US Forest Service for an urban forested patch and 20% canopy cover, which is how forested land is identified in the National Land Cover Database.
Whole acre, huh?
Full acre.
Yeah.
So the working definition for UFPs for this project, and I will read that all the way, are patches of trees an acre or more in size and with a minimum canopy cover of 20% in an urban setting, growing as an ecological system and excluding highly managed trees such as street trees and individual trees growing in manicured park settings, because those lack things like the understory and the habitat that we see in an actual patch. So I talked about urban forested patches being urban commons or common pool resources, depending on subtractability. So urban commons, as defined, are shared resources in an urban setting. They need to be city scale or smaller, things like parks or water systems. They generally have an indirect connection to user livelihoods, and that the benefits they provide are intangible rather than things that can be harvested physically. They're generally non-subjective, therefore are closer to public goods than our common pool resources. So urban forested patches on urban land may be urban commons if they're shared and if they're protected from the land being tractable or rivalrous in use. Important here is Foster's concept of regulatory slippage. This is when enforcement of existing rules or the rules themselves change, and then non-subtractability of a shared resource may become subtractable. So urban land is a subtractable resource when it's threatened by congestion or by rivalrous use, when one person's use of the land may impact negatively someone else's use. So therefore, a threatened UFP, where the land is attractive for development or the patch itself is degradable, may in fact become a common pool resource where subtractability trait has been in evidence. And I talked a little about ecosystem services in a couple previous slides. So ecosystem services are the prime benefits that something like an urban forested patch might provide people living nearby. They're intangible. They're things like stormwater sequestration or carbon sequestration or shade provision. And they're components of socio-ecological systems. They can range in scale from what you see as a tree there to city and even beyond. And important, as I keep saying, they're intangible. Kluve and Kova et al. Define ecosystem services as common pool resources. These researchers see them as depletable because the source that provides them is depletable, and they see that the difficulty of exclusion is rather high here. I'll argue that excludability could vary depending on the range of the ecosystem service that is provided. Local shade provision, you could argue that is excludable because it's such a small scale service, but something global or citywide is much more difficulty of exclusion. There's a lot of information that continue to provide about urban forested patches as far as commons. I also want to go into scale because throughout the course of the study, I've had this difficulty in picking what my resource unit and my resource system might be. And this is because in many cases, people consider the tree to be the resource unit. However, in the case of urban forested patches, you can look at a city and they'll have many, many patches, some of which are connected, some of which might be separate. So in that case, perhaps the patches themselves are the resource system. I've been looking for how to define this and finally found this paper that came out this year researchers were looking at resource systems with lake systems in urban settings, because the lakes exhibited this connectivity. Activity at one lake might impact activity in another, but then there's this whole system. So the lakes themselves could be considered a resource unit within a resource system. And you can see also from the diagram there on the right, there are adjacent action situations occurring within these large-scale resource systems and within these smaller single lakes, where actors may be working with one lake or several or the whole system, all of these impacting each other. So if I take this to urban forested patches, I see the larger resource system as a city's network of urban forested patches, then the resource system being an individual patch or potentially a tree or a group of trees within the patch, depending on the question being asked. And then of course there is flow between, as in the lakes, between seeds and water and pollution, all sorts of things that go within an urban setting. And the stewardship systems that apply to urban forested patches also are nested in a way. Some groups some groups work with an entire group of patches that throughout the city. Some work with one or two neighborhood patches. Some might work with an individual patch or a part of a patch. All of this together is what I used in attempting to address this, what turned out to be a hard question for me to ask and answer. In what cases do urban forested patches meet the definition of communal resources? And how are difficulty of exclusion and subtractability best considered in terms of urban forested patches? And so my best answer to this is following Foster. Urban forested patches can be urban commons. They can be shared resources with difficulty of subtractability until congestion or land use rivalry, conflicting demands, or biophysical conditions that cause degradation can cause the urban forested patch to become subtractable, either part of the patch or all of the patch, making it a common pool resources subject to the threats of degradation and destruction, and perhaps in use of user managed governance. Of course, UFPs vary in vulnerability to threat. In fact, Ogden et al. Found that many that persisted in Baltimore were in areas that were development, either for social reasons, like groups that were advocating for this patch, or for biophysical reasons, like steep slopes or riparian zones. And then I'll further argue that ecosystem services, because of their dependence on the livelihood of the urban forested patch, should be considered in the same way on a range from urban commons to common pool resources, depending on this element of subtractability. With that, I will move on to design principles, because if some urban forested patches are common pool resources and if they are user managed, we'd want to know what people could do to best manage them. So based off Ostrom's original work in governing the commons and then modified work in understanding institutional diversity and those design principles that came out, as well as these modifications by the other authors I have listed, I wanted to know which design principles apply to user governance of urban forested patches. So I needed to ask this question indirectly based on the research that I had found and on the principles. So what I'm going to start out with is kind of describing what I did, which was going through existing literature on urban forested patches, finding stewardship and governance practices that were mentioned by the authors that people were doing on these patches, and then trying to nest them within design principles that have been found in literature. So I'll do a little bit of a spoiler here and show where I found evidence for Ostrom's original principles. That was collective choice agreements, monitoring. I have a star next to sanctions because I didn't find sanctions, but what I found is incentives, which I consider tightly related. Recognition of rights to organize and manage the patch on their own, of course, and then a whole lot of evidence for nested enterprises, both horizontal and vertical. With these later modifications, you can see I looked at Cox et al., Parker and Johansson. I found, again, monitoring. I found a lot of evidence for this new suggested principle from Parker and Johansson for knowledge of the value of the resource, which they found to be especially applicable with urban settings. I have a star next to this clearly defined boundaries because these authors suggested that principle be relaxed in urban settings because of difficulty of exclusion. And I did find almost nothing about boundaries. So I think that is supported in what they were asserting there. And again, more evidence for these rights to organize for grounds up type management and governance. And then I looked at Foster and Ion's principles for urban commons and found evidence of collective governance, of course, and enabling state that allows people to work from the bottom up. And then a lot of experimentalism and being adaptive to change and trying new approaches and very place-based and neighborhood-based. So this, just for your reference, are the governance practices I found in each of these pieces that I went through. I won't go through that in detail because I kind of already did. So that brings me to doing my best to answer question 2, which of these principles are most applicable to successful governance and management, and do they need modification for urban forested patches? So those are summarized in the next slide. With this caveat that throughout this process, I've found that there needs to be a definition of successful governance of urban forested patches. I haven't made this definition yet, but I would suggest things like persistence and size over time, and biophysical measures like species diversity and structural diversity, invasive species, how healthy and how large is this patch continuing to be. But here are the governance practices kind of divided into the principles by category. So again, I've mentioned which principles I found evidence for is these 4 from Ostrom, then the additional knowledge from Parker and Johansson, 4 from Forestry, and then the modification that I'm going to be bold and suggest, which is to add incentives to the sanctions in Ostrom 5. So if we want to measure governance practices and their effectiveness within urban forested patches, I would say there needs to be a way to measure data over time, forest change over time, and which practices are associated with that. And what I find to be most applicable for that is the IFRI instrument, the International Forestry Resources and Institutions Data Collection Instrument, which I know was developed in the 90s with a lot of people that actually came out of the workshop to create this. And there were research areas worldwide. Like the forests were visited every 3 to 5 years, and a lot of data was collected, demographic, biophysical, and institutional, with the goal to study forest change over time with relation to institutional practices in place. There are 8 broad categories of data with multiple variables within. And ideally, each metric for each variable was measured at each time visit, with variables constant across study sites, so for both longitudinal and across site comparison. And of course, the IFRI is steeped in institutional analysis, which is why I include these frameworks on this slide. There's, of course, the IAD and then the SES, more used often for ecological type studies. But where I'm focused here is the CIS, which is the combined framework from the IAD and the SES. And I use this because in urban settings, things happen quickly, and we're able to identify a time and a threshold when a change has been made and what is being done. So these ecological and social categories from the SES are directly plugged into one spot. Then there's the action situation where a change was made, and you can see the outcomes, and you can see it is ongoing to where the next set of action situations would be happening in time. I got excited enough to apply the CIS to a existing paper because I don't have my own data yet. But what I did was looked at a case study of Baltimore from a Marzillo et al. Paper. So before 2010, there wasn't a lot of work being done in that city to govern or sustain urban forested patches, but there became an awareness, especially from the grounds up, that there were patches being lost and degraded in neighborhoods around the city. So groups, neighborhood leaders with the city, worked with the land trust and with the university, a lot of people partnered together to gain knowledge about the patches, where they were, how large they were, conditions, and ownership type variables, so they could know which patches were vulnerable, and created a forest stewardship program to engage citizens. And you can see on the right, after 2010, there are multiple community managed and steward patches. There are patch assessments going on throughout the city, lots of actors working together, and a whole lot of ground-based government systems in place, especially those that can empower the community to manage patches in their neighborhoods. So it's my goal to apply this framework to my work in Indianapolis next year. So as an overview, before I go into categories that might be modified for the IFRI tool in urban settings, here is just kind of an overview of what was in the original tool for anyone unfamiliar. There's an overview, and then there's the forest association, or groups that are working with the forest itself. There's the definition of the forest and its use by users, household demographics of people relying on the forest for subsistence, organizational groups that are working as far as government organizations or NGOs, ecological survey of the forest, and then kind of an assessment of products coming from the forest, especially in this case, tangible. So you can see these are definitely meant to be applied for subsistence forests, which is why I'll modify some for work in urban settings. And what I started to do to work with that was to take the original IFRI, and then again, some of these foundational pieces to look at variables within that might be useful in the collection instrument. So in addition to the original IFRI, the Johnson et al. Paper had a framework that has both social and biophysical factors and institutional factors that they considered important in analyzing interactions within an urban forested patch. And then on the right, the Marzillo et al. Figure is what I would consider to be kind of a layout of an action situation within the center of the CIS, with the actions and boots on ground type things that are going on to make a change. So between those sources, I created a table that would answer research question 3 about how this data collection instrument could be modified to be applied to patches in urban settings. So that would include an overview of the forest, and then again, a definition of the forest and how it's used by people, interactions between the forest and the user groups and who has access to it, an inventory of stewardship groups, government organizations, and NGOs, anyone that might be making decisions about the patch, detailed ecological survey. Those are all based off IFRI with modifications for urban settings based on this other work. And then 3 new additional areas: multi-layer governance, both horizontal and vertical, regional economies such as real estate markets, and historical and current known threats to the patch, either funding or biophysical degradation, land use change. So of course, that's really very much in the beginnings of development. There are some next steps I'd like to do with development of this instrument. First is application of the CIS, as I mentioned earlier, to urban forest patch data from Bloomington and Indianapolis. There are existing data sets that will be supplemented by upcoming research. And these might inform edits and modifications to the IFRI. A continued literature on urban forested patches and important variables found by any researchers, and again, to inform modifications. And within that work and additional work, development of specific variable lists and metrics for each category in the instrument, and then sharing and testing of it. So in conclusion, the intent of this project has been to investigate a resource that's pretty emergently studied using institutional analysis methodology. Outcomes of the work done to date include a description of the cases in which UFPs can be common pool resources, identification of some governance tactics as relevant to design principles that are common and potential success and resilience and persistence of urban forested patches, and the first steps in modification of the IFRI framework for use in UFPs. This work will continue, so I will further develop and tighten the concept of UFPs as common pool resources or as urban commons, continue to refine lists of successful governance tactics, and fully develop this IFRI tool as an instrument useful to anyone studying UFPs in any location. And with that, I just want to thank my PhD committee and everyone here at the workshop for the support that all of you have been giving me over the course of my PhD and this year in particular.
Thank you so much for this complete and theoretically strong presentation for us. I will start the words again.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. It's amazing to see it grow over the year and to see the thoroughness and detail that you bring to it. I'm curious when you've built up the IFRI database with lots of data on urban forested patches, what do you hope to do with the database? Like, what are the analyses that would be made possible by that? Who would have access to the data? Like, what are your dreams for it?
Okay, hopes and dreams is that it's able to identify what practices in place are in common in sustaining, especially the health, the resilience of urban forested patches, that it can be applied in multiple settings. So this means, of course, using it in multiple settings and making sure the data categories will work, right? But as far as access, I really think anyone should be able to have access to it.
Can I add? I'm curious about the urban FIA, the forest inventory analysis Forest Service does. There's an urban version now.
Yes.
Or has been for a while, I guess. And so it seems like for it to take off, an urban version of IFRI, it might be good to coordinate with their the data that they're collecting, right? Did you look at that and think about how that might integrated?
I have looked at that because that's how I made some of my definitions for what an urban forested patch might be. I haven't looked at their data per se and would love to get my hands on what they have across, because that could fill out a lot of questions that are had, and especially their biophysical data categories that they have would apply directly to development of this instrument.
Yeah, it seems like you would make the case that you're just adding institutional and social aspects to their inventory, right? Which is meant to be same place over time data collection, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so you're broadening it so it's more holistic.
I'm glad you just said that, because Ariana, I did neglect to mention that the ultimate goal is to be able to compare across sites and longitudinally. So yes.
We have a hand in the Zoom. Right. Ryan?
Okay, yeah, sure. Interesting presentation. I have to apologize. I came in about 5 minutes late, so maybe you talked about this, but you're talking about urban commons and common pool resources. And at least my understanding, one of the ways in which ideas from Lynn Ostrom and others evolved over the years was to make a clearer distinction between the characteristics of resources on the one hand and governance regimes or property regimes on the other. And in a sense, you can say, okay, one particular resource could be treated as private or public or as a commons. But that's not the way you seem to be doing this. So I'm interested. That's a kind of question of trying to understand how you're approaching it and what you're trying to get at in terms of this shift you're talking about between a commons and a common pool. Thank you.
That's a good question. I think I was mostly, I think I see the forested patches as being on a continuum between an urban commons and a common pool, depending on that element of subtractability of especially the land that the patch is residing upon. And I do think that property regimes and rights matter quite a bit in this and are. So are you asking how they would be managed based on property rights systems?
Well, in a sense, the way I've understood it is that, well, I guess it means what you mean by a commons. If you're meaning it as the resource characteristics as a public good or largely a public good, as opposed to becoming subtractable, congestible, depletable, then I guess that helps me understand that. Because when I hear the word commons, I very much think about that in terms of governance and people making claims on the resource and doing things to work together to control how it's used. Yeah.
Yes, I was particularly interested in like the degree of subtractability.
Okay. Good. Thanks.
You, Arnie?
So my experience with IFRI was, and IFRI is somewhat historic. That is, it was done, a lot of it was done in the 90s. It hasn't been very active in the last 10 years, so there hasn't been much growth or change in the, and it hasn't been modernized, I would say. Is that IFRI was looking at a community forest today, and then 5 years later, looking at it again. You're going to be looking at these urban forest patches today, and you're really curious about what happened in the past. How did it get to where it's today? How do you adapt IFRI to look at things in the past? For instance, governance structure, there's a few things you're going to be able to look at, but have you thought about how to do that?
It's an interesting question because there are some data points that are much more easy to get from the
Right.
past than there are
There's some things, you
present and future.
may not be able to do, but have you thought about going back 5, 10, 15? In the case of Bloomington, where we know things back 80 years in terms of aerial photography, we know which patches were there. But what can you look at in terms of other things in your database?
Things like land use history and ownership are things that I think could be easy to get from the past. Things like ecological conditions, I think would be much more challenging and could be gotten somewhat by aerial imagery. And somewhat by descriptions, existing descriptions.
I think that, to me, that really needs to be addressed and just sorted out, and then, okay, I can't do this, I can't do that, but I could do this, I could do that. Because I think that would help. If somebody else wants to do this, they may have some information about patches. They hadn't thought of it as an urban common or whatever. And so they may be able to say, oh, well, we already know this, this, and this.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think we can ask different questions from past to present than we can from present to future. However, that past to present can inform some of the present to future questions that could be addressed.
Gustavo?
Yeah, it's kind of I have more or less the same type of issues that Brian asked you. So it's let me try to reframe a similar question. It's like, so imagine with the same level of excludability and the same level of subtractability, that same resource can be fully privatized, can be run by, let's say, a local government, or can be run by users, okay, under different rules, okay? And you can also imagine mixed things, like, I don't know, the local governments, they are engaging, but then the community is doing some stuff. So it's, I think it's useful to make these distinctions, because it's like, part of the interesting thing is like, even with the same physical characteristics, if things are run and governed through different governance structures, maybe the outcomes could be different, no? So can you say a little bit more, maybe because I don't know about this topic, I'm not really getting exactly, are we talking about all the cases are essentially commons in the sense that are governed by the users, or no? Okay.
No, definitely not. And in
Okay.
fact, I think that's more the rarity. I think usually it's a network that there might be user governed that is also supplemented by whatever the city or the state, or whatever is doing to the rules in place that they have and what they provide as far as resources and even sometimes manpower. On top of that, urban forested patches might even be on private land where it's very little interaction. So I think there's a whole continuum.
See, I think the interesting thing, can I just a follow up? Okay, so the interesting thing would be to exploit those variations to see if there is something different in terms of the outcomes. It's like we get better outcomes when local governments, they're only providing these things, but then they allow the users. Whenever there is a private owner of a piece of this, then we get different outcomes. So again, maybe Brian, you were going in the same direction, but from my perspective, that's the juicy part of this. Maybe you disagree, but
I very much agree, actually. And that's where I think, especially in the governance practices that were mentioned in the existing research, there was a lot of that interaction between these groups, and to somehow quantify and pigeonhole what that interaction is, specifically how these groups are interacting, or how much, I guess I want to say pull, but how much action one group has versus another, where the power is in the interactions among the groups.
Jessica?
Yeah, this was actually on Bernie's point. And so it was mostly just to highlight there actually has been a little bit of an update. The Flare network, I can't remember who talked about this, but the Flare network, Miller, they have actually tried to shorten and update the survey. I don't know if you've seen this or not yet or not.
I've seen Flare, but I haven't seen what they did to shorten the survey.
Yeah, so, and Joe Bahati just used it like last few months in Uganda. So I know he's not doing urban forest patches, but he would at least be able to sort of tell you if or how this instrument is different. It has been piloted, and they've sort of just run a full pilot of this sort of shortened instrument with the full recognition that, it's like 300 pages. So it might be worth a conversation there, because it could be the case that something about that shortening actually makes it easier or more applicable, or less, right? In the urban context.
Definitely. No, I think that I would love to contact him and learn about that, because yeah, I've seen the original instrument and the amounts of questions that are involved. And I know, especially in one small urban setting, going through all of those, I'd like to see what Joe's doing. So
Shannon?
Oh, no, sorry, I was just. So same Bernie point, I was just thinking again about urban FIA. Like, if you're going back in time, could you use those plots?
that's a very good point. Yeah.
They have the small scale ecological data
They do.
that you would want.
Oh, yeah, I'll need to reach out and see if they allow access to that. That'd be great.
Yeah, yes, they do. It's all public.
My comment is, I think you'll be disappointed at urban FIA. There's a bunch of the plots are in a parking lot. They're not, they don't select urban forest patches per se. So they just It's just a, pattern you put down.
Randomized, yeah.
May though have a few big urban, tree planting nonprofits who may have added to the database or use it to collect some extra data. So there may be just a few, but there may be a few urban nonprofits you'll be able to go to and do better than FIA. But the FIA folks may know that.
Well, I
That's
wonder,
the reason to talk to FIA.
I was thinking that maybe there is a way on the FIA, if they have there might be a way to use a variable to exclude some of those parking lots as well, so.
Questions?
I think Brian may have.
Right.
This is interesting as a workshopper and the conceptual stuff, but as it happens, I'm also involved where I live in Greenbelt, Maryland, in two different forest preserve and a woodland owned by a housing co-op. And so have the perspective as a citizen and someone involved, including, okay, how do we get other people to come and support this and do more and so on? And listening to the presentation, what I seem to be hearing was mostly kind of an outside view and kind of, objective or fairly standardized, indicators, and those have their uses and are very valuable and so on. But I guess my question would be to what extent you're doing things that, understand insiders' perspectives, that look at the potential for self-governance, people's agency and how they use that, and also very important, or in a sense, even more fundamentally important, what their values are. Because for me, this has been an important part of trying to think through IED and SES, and wait a minute, how do we judge it? How do we evaluate it? And saying, actually, a very important part of that is, okay, what are the users trying to do? We can impose different external criteria, but what is it about for them, and how well they feel they're doing? So the question again is how you're understanding insiders' perspectives and their agency and action for self-governance and their values and evaluation. Thanks.
Thank you for that question, and definitely I don't understand the insiders' values yet, but the goal for the Indianapolis work is to include interviews of stewardship group members and people involved with patches to get a sense of this, because I do see that as very important. I think that's a way to get perspective of values and of reasons for people being involved with work with subsisting an urban forested patch, and also some of the challenges they face.
I have an easy question. Oh, Brian, go for it.
I was just going to follow up
Yeah.
quickly. That can get interesting, but also complex if you want to look at, okay, what may be differences between insiders' values and priorities and different kinds of, external sets of evaluation criteria, and how those play out in terms of the politics and the activities.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. Thank you.
I have an easy question. I don't think I heard you say it. Can you put a timeline in your work in front of us? I'm just, it sounds like you want to take this and now do interviews. And so what's sort of your?
So the Indianapolis project, the ideal timeline would be like
Yesterday.
a year and a half. The whole devising of the UFRI, especially given it's fresh, but also that there are resources like the urban FIA, like stewardship groups. Hopefully that can at least be started and ready for kind of sharing and testing within that same time period.
And in the context of your PhD, put it there too, right? So
Yeah.
your 18 months, you hope to have that designed, actually executed and written up. And your goal is to, in 2 years' time, in theory. Yeah, help me put it.
Yes.
Help me do the big picture, because I think you've got some people here who could also give you that feedback of, because this is amazing and a hell of a lot of work. But I think you also might need help, or maybe you don't, you got to graduate, right? So the two things go together, right? This is potentially 15 more years worth of work. Cause I think it's pretty cool. So I'm just, yeah, right? So there's people in the room who can give you that type of feedback of pull the Band-Aid, graduate.
Yes, and I so appreciate that because the goal is to finish summer of 2024, right?
Okay.
So.
Articulated date is huge.
But, and I do want help and feedback and support because I don't think this is not a one-person job.
Right.
I don't think that the tool instrument that I want to create will be done in that time period, but I think it would be framed out enough that it can continue to work on with input from other people.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you.
Fully on this not being a one-person job, as someone who is a product of undergraduate research, I highly encourage you to, I know Neil has a decent chunk of folks who are interested in undergraduate research. Hypothetically, it'd be great to pay for their labor. However, as someone who did it labor compensation free when I was an undergrad.
That's a good point.
Yeah, because mainly a lot of students that are looking to get into grad school, it looks great on the resume. So
Yeah, I want to make it that.
again, compensation's great. However,
You might be able to work with an instructor to do like independent
That's what I was
research for
looking
them. They get 3 credits.
yeah,
By working
that's
with
true. I
you
did that as
or
well.
with him.
Oh, to do that. Okay, that's a good point because I think, yeah.
They want to get something out of it on the transcript.
Yeah, exactly.
I love all these
They
ideas.
could host and they can work mostly with you.
Yeah.
That'd be good.
I think it's a really good environment for everyone. And because I think this is really cool and I agree that having help is never a.
Well, even things about, as I've described it, putting things into categories, I know for it to be valid, for me to make any sort of judgment like that, I need several sets of eyes so that it is user agreement.
I have like very unstructured seed of a thought that is just of interest to me. And so, and I have not kept up with how things have changed, the design principles, you know, and so I'm really intrigued by some of the suggestions that have been made. And the one about knowledge is really intriguing to me because I've grappled with this for a long time. As long as I've been studying urban forests, I've been thinking about the disconnect between what like a local group of people might feel about a patch of woods. When it becomes threatened, all of a sudden they start to speak up about why it's important to them. And you hear often references just to aesthetics, you know, and maybe a space for them to go and recreate, hike or whatever, those kinds of things. But it's just a very small portion of, as you know, the vast array of ecosystem services that urban forests actually produce. So they don't either have knowledge or clear, you know, recognition of all of those products, right? And then there are people in government, city government, local government that typically have more of that in mind, all of the ecosystem services, because they're a public servant and they have to get a budget to do their work. So they go out and they do the analysis of the ecosystem services dollar values. And they say, well, we'll save, you know, X millions of dollars in stormwater and X millions of dollars in energy costs because of this, you know. But they may not have the knowledge of the local people about how it's important for just their, you know, the aesthetics there, or their local use. And the disconnect between those two sets of knowledge are really interesting when you start to think about the nested enterprise of conservation of a space like that, right? And where do those two groups meet, right? And so again, it's not formulated in any way. I'm thinking about how that's a really interesting new suggestion about knowledge and how it's different between different groups. And that's probably not a novel idea. It probably plays out in lots of different resource systems in this way.
Interesting, and it relates to what Gustavo was saying earlier about like which groups work together and how those outcomes may depend on how those combinations are.
Yeah.
I guess for better terms. So yeah.
Yeah. Not sure which slide it was, but you're talking about interactions between ecosystems or.
Was it the nested resources?
Nested.
Go back to it.
You don't need to go back to the slide, but what it made me think about is Conrad Hagedorn's on purely natural interactions.
Hmm.
The idea that sort of weird idea in a way, treating sources as actors in action situations, but we can reconceptualize it as being, these knock-on effects. That's what he refers to as the natural interactions. Right, so you might want to look at some of his work.
Yes, can you repeat his name for me?
Conrad Hagedorn, Hagedorn.
Okay.
Can I add to that? Just that there was a speaker in this room, I don't know, 8 years ago, Lynn Westfall, right?
Yeah.
Came down here and talked about ecosystems as actors and that they actually sanction us. There are natural sanctions from nature.
Right.
So she wrote about that too.
Okay. Well, okay, I know her name.
James?
So I have I've got a question. You're using the CIS framework as opposed to the SES. And a lot of this work has relied on the SES. Can you explain again why you're choosing the CIS over the SES and how you think it's gonna work out better?
Yes, because I had previously been pretty much always SES. What I like about the CIS is that there are these points in what you identify, and you look through what the history of a particular resource system. And I think it's because of this history base that I'm drawn to it and future, trajectory based. So identify a point where things changed, or a point and then a change and the actions that were involved with that change and then the outcome. And you can track changes within based on institutional arrangements and actions done that have changed the biological conditions or the social conditions of that resource.
So it's the more temporal aspect of it.
Exactly, is the temporal, and especially since I'm interested in change over time, and especially at least in my mind, in urban systems with the quick pace of change, it's a little easier, and especially with records kept, it's easier to identify a year or a sequence of years when institutional arrangements may have changed.
Thanks, because I always struggle with which one should I use and.
Yeah, I went through back and forth with the IAD and the SES, and I think part of that, again, I was drawn to that it is kind of combined in my mind, some of the elements of each in a way that, especially when looking at historical cases or potential future cases, it resonates to me.
I just add to that one of our conceits in doing the CIS was that the IAD and SES were never supposed to be distinct frameworks to begin with.
Oh, they were.
The SES was designed to subsume the IAD. Now, in our version, we've got the IAD basically subsuming the SES because we think it works.
The idea is supposed to be a piece within the SES.
Well, now, the way the CIS is designed, the SES is a part of the IAD, and which makes sense in that the IAD is supposed to be a highly generalized framework for diagnosing problems, not just limited to, ecological problems. So,
Thanks.
Yeah.
Teach a class on that.
No, right?
Yes.
I saw that in Chicago, they have, you guys are probably familiar already, but the Morton Arboretum has this Chicago Regional Tree Initiative. And that's a pretty, so you're already familiar with that database, because it looks like it's pretty comprehensive for urban forested patches. I didn't know if that was basically, would that be a useful comparative case study? If that is a useful data set, there's a lot of ifs there.
I think it could be. It's regional, so it has urban and then outlying forests within it. I haven't looked at the data set itself. Sarah, have you looked at their data set? Okay. I know of them, and they were also part of the set of case studies that I included the Baltimore, but Chicago one was another one where there was a group of people that noticed that there were a lot of invasive species and such in the patches of forest around the Chicago area, got this giant kind of regional group together, worked lots of different types of actors like nonprofits and universities and government to work together to address that. So,
So
I'll send you the link.
the Chicago database, or the group that works in Chicago is mammoth in terms of, it goes from almost Milwaukee all the way over to Michigan.
Oh, wow,
It covers about 19 counties.
Wow.
And so they've got data on individual trees and whatever.
Mhm.
They've also worked with kind of a land trust perspective of trying to protect forest corridors,
Mhm.
particularly along waterways.
Mhm.
So those would be patches that you might be able to look at.
Yeah.
They don't, my impression is they don't look at governance per se, so you have to think about how to do that. But it's a massive bit, and Baltimore's got a similar approach, and there's a couple other large initiatives, multi-urban area initiatives that have got some data like that, but each one of them is independent and different.
Yeah.
There's no commonality. You're like, oh, Chicago will be like, no, each urban area is different. So you could take one of those and adapt it, but
Mhm. Mhm.
try to combine them that's another 2 years of work. That
That's
you
right.
don't want to get involved in, right?
Another piece. Research agenda.
I like a research agenda.
Yeah.
So, not for your dissertation, please, but for follow-up and idea. Maybe it's interesting to start seeing the possibility of matching urban patches with urban segregation. So I'm sure that there are urban patches in poor and rich neighborhoods. Are they working the same way? So it's again, you can even think about the evil political economy option in which urban patches are used by rich communities to to some extent reinforce segregation as a way of elevating the cost of poor families to enter in some neighborhoods. So again, maybe it's a completely crazy idea, maybe it's interesting, but again, probably reflect my lack of knowledge on the topic. But given all the work that people are interested right now in, urban segregation, and what's going on, and then a lot of potential programs to deal with that. Of course, it's not new, but it's definitely an important area. If you can connect your research with that, I think could be cool.
Yeah, I agree, because there definitely are what you just described, findings of patches being, of course, more prevalent in wealthier areas. And then when there's the whole gentrification of once green space is added to less wealthy areas. And then also in work that I was recently reading for this paper, the urban forested patches themselves are often larger in areas with larger lots, because in the smaller areas where they grow up in vacant lots, those lots are smaller and there's less space for there to be a patch. So just super interesting, lots of stuff to go off of there. So,
But not for you.
Not-
No,
That's right.
not 1 year. No, it's like, yeah. Your advisors will.
Yeah.
They are emailing me now with
Check
insults probably.
You think of a WOW 7 panel track around this.
Mhm.
A WOW 7 like panel or track. This is great. Well, do you have any maybe final kind of reflections, thoughts?
No, thank you all for listening. Thank you for all the feedback. I feel like this chapter is very much a work in progress. So I appreciate all of the advice I've been given and
Oh, yeah.
take it to heart and make my work even better. So thanks again for coming out, like second to last week's classes and.
Make a comment.
Mhm.
Remember, she already has one chapter published. So she's got an earlier chapter that's published. And there's another chapter, there's another related paper that's been submitted to a journal. So she has made some real progress. This theoretical.
Maybe you should consider. Changing your.
Theoretical one is a challenge.
Yeah.
It's the hardest chapter. That's why I wanted to present it actually, is I knew it was the hardest one. The other ones are less so.
It's terrific. Well, congratulations. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.